Copyright notice. You are free to download and copy this work in audio format for replay in any audio or video mode, and I encourage you to do so and enjoy and learn. You may redistribute it in a non-commercial fashion, that is, not for profit directly or indirectly. You may not sell or seek to profit from this publication in part or in whole, nor may you translate it into any written format for any purpose. Thank you. Chapter 24 of the e-novel survival novel, When the Walls Came Tumbling Down, as read by the author. Justice. A hard drizzle pelted everything now. It had come up suddenly and was accompanied by a slightly cool wind from the north. Danny pulled his jacket up around his neck against the chill and walked down the center of the almost surreally smooth street with Big Mike. The wire accompanied them, giving them both an update on the status of the compound, pointing out features like the solar street lamps with their own arrays and battery backups, marveling at the obvious and enormous expense of it all. They all could not believe how elaborate, how well set up this place was. Mike also assessed that it was indeed very defendable, and all agreed it was a very solid setup for long-term survivability. Most of all, they could not believe how lavish the homes were. The servant area was itself, by comparison, small but equally well laid out. Danny had given instructions to go easy on the inhabitants there, to treat them like citizens, the club term for a non-outlaw. Everyone understood the reason why. They needed these people to keep the place afloat. If they were happy, they would all do a better job. Casualties had been fairly high, but not nearly as much as expected. Outside the perimeter, near the wood's edge, a graveyard was selected. The bodies of 17 of the 1%ers, brothers, would be laid to rest there in individual graves. Near this would be a single large pit dug to bury the members of the security team. Mike insisted they put up a marker of some kind. These men had put up a righteous fight. The bodies of the inhabitants would be buried in an unmarked mass grave that would be dug later. A backhoe was digging out the individual grave sites even now. The vehicles that had transported the entire group south had been sent back north, back to the clubhouse with one driver per vehicle, plus a gunner on each of the crew-served weapons. One of the gun trucks was inoperable, and its machine gun was mounted hastily onto another of the convoy trucks. Dirty and the Snake would be leading the convoy back, and the instructions were to bring everyone in the compound back, as well as all the gear, especially the weapons and ammo cache, and of course the motorcycles. This would mean nearly everything that could roll would head back south. There were 2 semi-trucks onto which the members' bikes had been loaded just a few days prior to the attack. Some of those bikes would be used for parts now because their former owners had departed this vale of tears. These semi-trucks could get within about 10 miles of the lair, and everything then would have to be brought in from there. The fallen would be moving into the Eagle's lair. Under new management, read a sign someone had scrawled onto the side of one of the towers, which Danny found amusing. An image of the club members riding their motorcycles around inside the compound, a sort of victory run, although there was no road per se in the compound, danced in his head. He missed the club runs now. Tank, a hulking, somewhat overweight club member, actually knew how to run a dozer quite well. They had found one parked behind the maintenance shop, a new John Deere D6. Danny could hear it growling in the distance as the dozer worked now to cut a road in from the road ahead back to them here, once the fallen's gear and equipment would be brought in down the road. Big Mike said the road would be excellent because it would channelize any intruders and would be easy to control and observe. True, there were millions of details to manage and learn, but what impressed Danny was how eagerly the technicians and workers were at helping, at pitching in. At first, the bearded and rough appearance of the fallen, combined with their overwhelming assault and violence of action, had caused these people to run and hide. Danny had assured them over the speaker system that as long as they helped, they would not only be guaranteed safety, they could live here and be a part of the compound. There was plenty of room, and Danny knew they would need every worker bee they could find. This was the primary reason why he had ordered the summary execution of any of the wealthy, except for ones that the club members wanted to take as personal servants, the pretty women, for instance. Their choices would be simple: prostitute themselves for a place to live or walk out the south gate. Danny had found out about the south gate from one of the technicians and had seen it himself. He also learned that some of the inhabitants had managed to run away into the forest. Those woods would not welcome such as them, and he knew their chance of survival was less than zero. Worse still for them, if they managed to make it somehow to civilization, they would not be welcome there either. They had no skills that would be useful in this new world. The job creators and wealth producers would be those who did so with their own labor and hands, invested their own money and resources, what little they had. Danny smiled when he thought, what righteous justice. The very ones who had robbed so many people blind of their pensions and savings, homes and jobs, were at this moment having to see what it was like to live in fear and hunger without shelter, not sure when their next meal would come from or where. They were having to reach for bootstraps on their Gucci loafers. For most of them, this would be their first and last experience of real hunger and fear before they died of dehydration, hunger, exposure, or wild animals, and even more savage human predators. Big Mike had assigned technicians and workers to fix the fences where they had been breached earlier and to string new concertina wire there. One opening would be left in place for now. It would be the route the trucks and other equipment used to enter from the new road being cut today. The biggest home had belonged to someone named Casolo. The butler, Johnson, had been standing in his uniform outside the front door and had greeted Danny earlier that day with a pleasant smile and a slight bow at the waist. Danny just stood there and smirked at the man, but Johnson seemed nonplussed and said, "Good day, sir. I am Johnson, your butler. Would you like a tour of your new home?" Danny stood tapping his foot for a second, not sure what to make of all this, before he said, "Sure, Johnson." With that, the man had opened the door and said, "Follow me, please, sir." Then, "Would you care for something to drink or eat, sir?" Danny said, "Yeah, how about a beer and a sandwich?" And the man had smiled and said, "Of course, sir. Domestic or imported?" Danny could not believe it. They were lucky to get a beer of any kind back at his compound, and these freaks had imported beer. "Get me a bottle of German beer and a sandwich," Danny ordered, adding, "And get one for yourself and sit down with me." Over beer and a sandwich, Danny had explained, "Look, Johnson, I don't need a butler. I don't even know how to use one." Then continued, "I do need someone to run this house. A sort of house mouse to keep it cleaned up, keep food in the fridge." The man nodded as he ate hungrily and took a long drink off his own beer. Danny regarded him a moment, then said, "I'm the president of this club. We're a motorcycle club. We're 1%ers. The man nodded, swallowed, and set his sandwich down and said, "Sir, you are my boss. If you tell me you want me to pick up trash, that's what I will do. I get paid, in a sense, by being allowed to stay here. This is my job." Mike liked that attitude and answered. "Good," he said. "I need you to keep me abreast of the other technicians." The man chewed on his sandwich a second and asked, "In what way, sir?" Mike smiled and said, "I need to know what the people are up to, if there are problems, issues, and squabbles." The man understood and nodded. "Ah, sort of like a temperature gauge then, sir." Mike said, "Bingo," then held up his sandwich as he chewed on a bite, took a swig of the beer and said, "You make a good sandwich for a skinny guy, too." Johnson smiled. He knew he was in. He also knew that John Casolo was angling to get a relief force to come to this place. He would need to get the secure satellite phone, which was currently locked in the safe. He had given Johnson the combination and told him to bring the phone and charger to him so he could call the senator. Johnson thought about that now for a minute. The rough and dangerous-looking biker was nobody to trifle with. He had the look of a killer about him, and indeed, he had seen his men do much of that already today. He probably had a litany of bad habits, and maybe even a violent temper, but all that combined still made him far more palatable than his former employer and his ilk. He liked the sound of that phrase, former employer, and realized he had just made a decision. When the time was right, he would tell his new boss about the presence of the old boss, but not just yet. Johnson had shown Danny around his new home, and the man tried to act like it was nothing all that new to him, but they both knew better. The huge master bedroom, the sunken tub, the ornate fixtures, the bar, all of it was quite opulent. Fortunately, the tour was cut short because Danny had decided to leave before seeing the details. Perfect! He would show it to him later. In the interim, he had some business to take care of, a promise to keep. Locking the front door, Johnson swiftly went to the vault and opened it. Inside, he found 2 small footlockers with wheels on them. He loaded one of them with about half of the remaining precious stones and almost 100 pounds of gold in 1-ounce bars. The satellite phone and the charger as well. On top of this, in the trunk, he put some sheets and towels. He was amazed at how heavy the trunk was despite its relatively small size. Although under 130 pounds, it felt like much more than that. He left enough of the loot so as not to arouse too much suspicion with Danny when he finally went in. Then he pulled the locker out into the bedroom, locked the vault behind him, and wheeled down the hall, careful not to scratch or scuff the hardwood floors. It took him much effort to get it out to the garage, sweat pouring from his forehead. He covered this with a lot of boxes and junk, some paint cans and other debris. He would tell Danny this was trash that needed to be taken to the recycling place and would use the golf cart, which he would retrieve later that morning, for this task. He would do all of this after he dealt with John Casolo, though. Johnson would rather work for them than the former inhabitants anyway, although he would prefer they had none of them. Still, one could not have everything he desired in this life, and good came with the bad. The bad that Mike and his club represented were far more palatable, it seemed. Casolo had never allowed his servants to eat in his presence, much less talk to them or make eye contact. Johnson would keep his promise to himself to get even with Casolo, and it would be this very day. Smiling contentedly to himself, he walked toward the hangars to retrieve the golf cart. He would drive it to his home and deal with Casolo. He relished this thought as he walked. Prelude. The ATV roared down the trail at breakneck speed, carrying Jacqueline and I while a young woman drove. I couldn't believe how much had transpired, how much had occurred in just 3 days I was gone. As we neared the rail bridge, I noted the presence of patrols and activity everywhere. At a point about 600 yards from the bridge, just around the bend, there were huge log barricades set up that made us slow to a crawl. The ATV barely fit between them. The barricades ran all the way into the woods where the deep drainage line on one side was its steepest and the river cut back in, a good natural barrier and obstacle. I knew Bill would have the barricades under observation and covered with rifle fire as well. A good obstacle has to be covered by both, or the enemy will simply show up and remove them at leisure. The town was a blur of activity. Everywhere people were busy as beavers. I felt even more guilty when I saw how much had been done. Bill came out to greet us and gave me the Cliff's Notes version. Al, I'll give you the down and dirty. We have an enemy force of over 100 people training up right now to hit us. Bill went on with little pause. They have 6 gun trucks, 2 M2 50 caliber machine guns and 4 with 7.62 machine guns. He paused then to let this set. Cynthia and Robert shot video. If you want to see it, I can run it up. I shook my head and said, "No need, Bill, just show me the plan." He nodded and then led us inside to the map. On the map, there was an overlay of clear film, and on these were lines drawn in grease pencil. I recognized the military symbols and smiled at Bill. "I didn't know you guys in the Air Force knew these things," I said, admiring the work. "What, you mean military symbols?" "Al, I was security forces in the Air Force." "Sort of the Air Force version of infantry," he paused, then added, "only with a higher IQ. I was too focused on the map to register the barb. I could see the primary and alternate positions delineated as well as the dummy ones, fields of fire as well. Bill then explained the scheme of maneuver. With a piece of wire, he pointed to Claremont Farms. "We know they are going to come from Claremont Farm. We have a team observing them, so we'll know. Anticipating my question, he stated, "Right now they are rehearsing." I nodded and he moved to the coffee pot. "Coffee?" he asked, and I said yes. Jacqueline stopped him and said she would get it for us both. Bill continued. "Mark is monitoring them as well in case we miss the calls." He explained, "They came through the town with a 2-vehicle recon, Al. I thought they were official army at first." Jacqueline brought him his coffee, and he smiled at her and took a sip, then added, "But we figured out they were essentially casing the joint." He delivered the last in his best Bogart imitation. Bill laid out what he anticipated their attack might look like, giving me their scheme of maneuver. The enemy would try to engage our roadblocks with heavy fires and pin us down while their crew served weapons, while they sent in their maneuver elements, the bus people, to flank our positions. They knew we did not have their numbers and certainly not their firepower. Bill had set up dummy positions to draw their fire and said he would lead the maneuver platoon around to try and knock out the crew-served weapons from the flank or rear. "The cavalry riding down the archers, eh, Bill?" I quipped, and he smiled in agreement, realizing the obvious inference to a proven tactic. "Something like that. I'll be leading that, and you will have the defenses here." At that, several of the squad leaders began to filter in. I said, "A moment, Bill," then smiled and shook hands with them. They looked haggard and tired, dirty but more. They all looked a bit nervous. "I called them here, Al, because I thought you would want to make changes to the plan." I held up a hand and cut him off. "No, the plan is good." "But don't you want to tweak the plan, make changes? I mean, it's not perfect and there are judgments I stopped him again and said, "Bill, even a 60% plan will succeed if everyone understands it. You never make changes at the line of departure, and I think we passed that long ago. Furthermore, Bill, this is a solid plan, and you will lead the defenses. I'll take the maneuver element." I felt Jacqueline tense at that one. My calf made me very immobile, and she was no doubt certain I was going to get myself shot again. "But, Al, there is a lot of risk involved in that plan. It wasn't frankly that good, but that was all I could come up with," he stammered. I smiled and put my hand on his shoulder and said, "Bill, the risk is acceptable. It's necessary. We will make it happen." Turning to the squad leaders, "We will go with the plan as briefed," I said. "Bill is in charge." Then, turning to him, I said, "Bill, what time do you want to hold the leaders' final meeting?" The words "final meeting" sounded ominous, and I wished I had chosen a better phrase, but none came to mind. I could see the leaders were nervous, and I needed them to impart confidence to their people, not fear. "This is a rock-solid plan, people, and it will work," I said. There were some confident smiles now. "If we stick together and everyone does their duty, remembers their part, everyone has to do their part." This put pressure on the men, but also made my assurances real. A leader who glibly says everything is okay to his troops as they are about to walk into battle sees his unit come apart when they do take casualties. When that happens, they don't believe anything he has said before. "Who is on the maneuver element?" I asked, and Paul said, "I am, Al." Paul was one of my most experienced squad leaders, a combat veteran infantry with a tour in Afghanistan. He had also seen some action here lately with the looters and infiltrators. I stood with the other squad leaders and looked at Bill, signifying now that he was officially in charge. Bill asked a few of the squad leaders to stay to update him on their defensive positions and make sure the map was up to date, then dismissed everyone, saying, "Be here at 1700 unless we get the call sooner. That's all, unless we have questions or something for the group." There were none, so everyone milled out, but a few people got themselves some coffee, which was not actually coffee, but some sort of herbal concoction that tasted like it, but nobody said anything. It was better than nothing, and it was hot. I looked at Jacqueline, and she gave me the evil eye and then spun around and left. I would never understand this woman if I lived to be 100. Motley crew. The loss of the other men whom they had served with was a bit of a blow to all, especially the ones who had died in the fiery helicopter crash. One of the men, Florian, said he saw the bird crash and a couple of bodies fly out on the impact as the fuel tanks burst open and erupted, making the demise of everyone a certainty. Although it was part of their trade, part of their chosen occupation of arms, it was not always easy to deal with. Tim was glad, therefore, to have a project to put the men on. It would keep them all occupied. They would make their way north to Owlstown and see if they could at least get temporary shelter. They had plenty of gold. Problem was, right now, gold was not nearly as valuable as things like food or shelter. Tim had gotten an important lesson on the value of things when he was in 7th Special Forces Group. They had been in the jungle and needed assistance from some nearly aboriginal tribesmen. They wanted to be paid in exchange for taking Tim and his team downriver in their canoes, but had refused payment with any kind of money. They had no use for such things. The natives wanted one of their weapons, and Tim could not do that. Tim had countered with the offer of medicine from the team's medic, figuring to turn this into a sort of medcap mission, but that was also refused. They had no concept of this, it seems, as well. Eventually, the team had given up their knives and dog tags. The value of the knives was obvious to these men. The dog tags were seen as a magic talisman, what the interpreter could make out from, although he did not speak their dialect and had to use a common trade language of which they knew very little either. In the end, they had gotten home, but Tim learned that the value of any item was only as high as what the recipient put on it. A quick estimate, and he figured they had about 700 pounds of gold altogether, plus miscellaneous precious stones and some platinum. The gold alone was nearly 15 million in pre-WROL, without rule of law, US dollars. Right about now, he knew that gold was not nearly as valuable as things like food, medicine, firearms, and ammo, and of course some shelter, something of which they had slim to none and would pay dearly for all. The men had agreed on two things about the gold. First, it would be divided equally, and second, they would barter with it only if it was for necessities. Right now, there was not so much demand, so there was for the essentials. The men were all hand-picked professionals, and Tim was glad for this for a number of reasons. A simple and quick huddle, Tim announced his idea, and soon everyone was working on it. They would move north to Owlstown and try to hold up long enough to figure out their next move. Each of them was now officially a millionaire and then some, if they could live long enough to spend it, that is. Normally accustomed to a world that was categorized by plans and discipline, Tim and his men found themselves like a boat without a rudder at the moment. Yes, they still had each other, but their options were indeed limited. None of them had a truly cohesive plan other than to bug out, which they had effectively done already. Now they would need to decide, and Tim had a responsibility to offer to lead them to a place of safety. To get there, they would need to travel the roads now, and especially later when the helo eventually would run out of fuel. To do this safely, they would need armor. Traveling the ambush-laden roads in soft-skinned vehicles was suicide. The large dump truck with a snowplow on it, while not armored, would have to do. Tim had helped load bags full of road sand into the back of this dump truck. These would provide additional protection. The M240 machine gun on the cargo helicopter would have been one of two, but Casolo had denied his request for that as well. Tim had actually asked for miniguns on the helicopters as well as in several of the towers, but despite Casolo's connections, he said it was impossible. Tim highly doubted this and figured it was one more way Casolo, who liked to pretend he was an expert on everything, was asserting his control. If they had miniguns in the compound, it would have changed the dynamics of the defenses there dramatically. The 240s they had, though, did have egress or dismount kits stowed on each aircraft as part of the system, which would allow them to be converted over to ground unit use. The butterfly trigger would be removed and replaced with the kit's handguards, trigger group, buttstock, and buffer. And most importantly right now, the bipod. The machine gun would be fired over the top of the cab of the truck, and the gunner would have to be protected with little more than sandbags. The other gun was left as it was on its articulated mount on the back left of the small four-seater observation helicopter. In order to operate the gun, the doors had to be left open on the rear, and nobody inside liked that part very much. Being outside in the cold is one thing. Being outside in the cold with frozen rotor wash was a completely different scenario. Florian, one of the better shots in the unit, would take the right rear seat. He had been trained as an aircraft sniper during his previous life in 2nd Ranger Battalion. Tim had listened in on radio traffic back at the lair and knew that the roads were hazardous. They always were in any country he had operated in where there was no government, no control, no rule of law. He didn't want to have his men killed in an ambush driving along in soft-skinned vehicles. In the Loach, or observation helicopter, Tim would fly out ahead of the dump truck and all the men would load into the back of it. The plow was the old heavy steel type and looked like it might stop some small arms fire, but definitely not anything heavy. Still, it would provide front protection to the driver, the engine, and the front wheels. Steel plates were scavenged from the scrap pile at the airfield and set in place on the doors for the driver, propped up on the inside with sandbags. The driver would crawl in through the window. The Loach would help them scout out any potential road hazards, roadblocks, and ambushes, and would act as the scout element, an armed scout element. The cargo pilot would drive the dump truck now. He and the co-pilot were both former members of the elite 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, or SOAR, and could fight as well as fly. They had siphoned every bit of fuel out of the bird and transferred it into the heavy-duty steel tanks on the sides of the dump truck, using discarded 5-gallon paint buckets for the task. They left their bird with the rotors tied down more out of habit than anything else. She would require serious and significant repairs and probably never fly again. Elsewhere, the men were readying to leave, and Tim had said movement would be predicated upon completion of the truck first, and then a convoy briefing, followed by a few rehearsals and some dry runs in the back of the truck. Tim got out his notebook and began writing out a simple 5-paragraph order, praying that his friend Al was still living in the town. If not, Plan B was not looking too solid at the moment. It was non-existent, in fact. Shock troops. Ox and Mitchell watched the rehearsals with much dismay, Mitchell especially. It was all he could do to not lose his temper, much less his mind, at the seeming ineptitude of the speed bumps as they fumbled through everything. They both forgot how much they took for granted the lessons soldiers got in basic training. Things like understanding what it means to take cover versus just hiding behind something like a bush, which is sort of like concealment, unless, of course, the enemy sees you doing it. Then it is neither. Without even the basics of IMT or individual movement techniques, these people would be shock troops, Ox thought. He would be shocked if any of them survived. Going up against an enemy who would have prepared positions would be suicide, but Mitchell had a plan. His recon had shown that the town was not well set up for defense, and he believed the gun trucks could advance along the old rail line and the main road and pour covering fire out on the bridge positions, and the speed bumps could move up on foot using the cover and concealment of the heavy woods. Mitchell would make the call on which bridge to cross. They were about a half a mile apart, and if they moved up through the center of the woods between them, they would be concealed until the last second when they made their decision. Meanwhile, the town's paltry defensive force would be effectively pinned down by the gun trucks. Mitchell had just sent 2 of the speed bumps, who had prior military training in, to do a recon of the route and make sure that no defenses had been in fact erected. They had left just half an hour ago and had reported over the Singars that they were nearing the edge of the forest. They would probe into the woods, then sweep left and right to make sure there were no LPOPs, or listening post, observation posts, set up to alert the town. Then there was Maria to consider. In a few hours they would be issuing live ammo, and Ox had every reason to believe she might just shoot him immediately. He told Mitchell to take her firing pin out of her weapon. She wouldn't know the difference until it was too late anyway. Mitchell's response was not good. He gave him a disgusted look and said, "No," and then walked away. Ox was losing his command, and it made him angry and more than a little scared. What would he do now? If these people knew the truth about him, they would turn on him. Mitchell was no doubt waiting for the right moment, probably after the attack, to make his move, to take charge. Ox would be ready, though. He had a plan to deal with Mitchell and Maria. By then, the force would be whittled down to less than half of the speed bumps, and maybe they would be missing a soldier or two, although with the armor and the plan to keep the gun trucks at a distance, engaging from beyond effective rifle fire, he doubted the latter. Depew. Bill had at first thought putting Linda and Kevin together was a bad idea. He was concerned they would be more worried about each other and focused less on their duty. The defensive positions were set up using the Depew method. Here, the defenders did not shoot directly at the person attacking them. They had overlapping fields of fire instead, which meant they were shooting from behind cover, but their attacker, if moving in a direction or on an axis of march, would essentially be shot at somewhat from the side, at about a 30 to 45 degree angle. This, of course, meant letting the enemy get a bit closer. Bill had a plan for that, too. About 20 feet behind each hole was an alternate position which they would occupy and use to take longer shots. Each hole was instructed to carefully take aim at just one target and to shoot one round at their target on command before going to ground and low-crawling back into their Depew holes. The first volley would cause the enemy to go to ground, cause confusion, and also throw off the rhythm of their attack. They might even inflict some casualties, and Bill had seen something in the videos brought back by Bill and Cindy. While the force appeared to be led by military, the bulk of the foot soldiers were some obviously untrained civilians. These might possibly melt under pressure and lose their nerve if they got hit first, and got hit early. If nothing else, it would at least slow them down and throw off the attack. Bill was also worried about casualties. Head wounds were the most common suffered by people fighting from foxholes. The Depew system was supposed to counter that. The Depew was also something he had never used, but had only heard of and knew it was taught to the military at some point. But the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan had not been against a modern army, but rather a guerrilla force that required the military to be mobile and go on the offensive and attack the enemy where they found him. The FOBs were like fire bases from this war and were not linear defenses that the Depew was designed for. Thus, it had never been tested in combat. Kevin and Linda were now digging their last foxhole of the three. It was hard work, and she was grateful for Kevin's strength and also for his protective manner over her. She was frankly more than a little scared right now and having second doubts about volunteering. Not about the idea of it, but whether she would do her duty when the time came. She watched as Kevin swung the mattock to burst through a large root and heard the satisfying thump as it did so. "Yes," he said, swinging again, cutting off another large chunk of the offending root. "Hand me the shovel, Linda," he said, tossing the pick aside and holding his hand back behind him without looking at her. She blew her hair from her face and handed it to him, and he dug out the earth with his pickwork. She noted his shoulders sagging, and he was getting tired. He would never willingly step aside and let her do her part on any of the work she had learned, so she had to tell him to stop. "Hey, quit hogging up the fun. My turn to dig," she said, and playfully pushed him a little out of the way. Wearily, he climbed out of the hole and flopped down against the tree as she dug. "You're a hard worker, Linda," he said honestly. It sounded like the beginning of a sentence, and after a moment she realized he probably had a lot more to say, but had decided as usual not to. And so she said, "Thanks, Kev. So are you." She had taken to calling him Kev because nobody else did, and he didn't seem to mind. She was a sight, too, dirty, sweaty, and in desperate need of a shower, as they both were. They would sleep well tonight, or so they hoped. Morosely, she wondered if it would be their last night. She stopped for a moment and thought about that, and Kevin looked up at her. She held a hand up as if to ask for a moment, and then went back to shoveling. Her mind was thinking about that one. What if this was their last day on this earth? Her own mortality made her a little nervous. She had heard soldiers come back from the war and say that life seemed richer because they knew better than to waste it on following foolish ideas and conventions any longer. They would go do things they had dreamed of, sometimes reckless things like climbing mountains or skydiving, and sometimes drink and drive and get killed. Still, all in all, they understood one very important detail. Nobody has a guarantee of tomorrow. Nobody. She plunged the shovel into the dirt and climbed out of the foxhole, a determined look on her face. Kevin stood up because he sensed something was wrong, but he couldn't be more wrong. Nothing was wrong. Suddenly everything was right. She was not going to let her fear rob her of another day. She walked up to Kevin and took both of his hands in hers, taking him quite off guard. You have flattered me with your patience and your persistence. In normal times, we would have been required to wait. He started to speak and she cut him off. Required by people who already have their hearts filled and find it easy to judge others. Looking up at him, she said, Kevin, this is a new world, and I know my heart. It says you're a good man. Kevin did not know what to say, and she thought this was a good thing because when he spoke, it was usually awkward anyway. He stood there dumbfounded. Linda knew she would have to drive this train if it was going to get to the station, so she did. She touched his face with her hand and then stood up on tiptoes and kissed him gently, hanging onto his hand with hers for balance. He put his other arm around her waist and drew her near strongly as he kissed her back. She was quite pleasantly surprised to see he was a good kisser, and felt puzzled at the little twinge of jealousy this thought aroused. Who had taught him to kiss like that, she wondered, and then smiled to herself, thinking, My, Linda, jealous already. What's so funny, he grinned at her, touching foreheads. Nothing, she said, and kissed him again. After several kisses, she could see where this was going, and they had serious work to finish first. We better stop, she said, pulling back. Kevin looked hurt and said somewhat dejectedly, I understand. She kissed him again quite passionately and said, motioning with her head to the foxhole, No, you don't understand at all, Kev. We really have to finish this foxhole. She turned, jumped into the hole, and said, Let's finish quick so we can go swimming and get clean. I know the perfect spot. Kevin sat down now, not sure if what had just happened was real. He assumed she meant swimming in their underwear, but he wasn't wearing any and didn't have many clothes, and it was as it was, so he asked, Well, what are you going to wear to swim in? Without stopping, she said, Same thing as you, Kev, then added very coyly, Nothing, then threw a shovelful of dirt at him and laughed. Shocked at first, he had to laugh, but then what she said hit him like a tidal wave. Swim. Together. Nothing. And all he could do was just smile. Wow, the things a day might bring. This has been Chapter 24 of the e-novel survival novel, The Walls Came Tumbling Down, as read by the author. Tune in next Friday for Chapter 25.